Hello, it's time to wrap up our second slideshow from chapter 3, where we're learning more about the capacities of ggplot. Uh, Previously in this slideshow, we've talked about univariate displays. We've talked a little bit about bivariate displays when we've got a categorical and a numerical variable. We're going to start off in this video by looking at scatterplots, where we have two numerical variables. And then we're going to go finally to line plots, where we're doing some things over time. So for scatter plots, we've done some work with this already with geom_point. So let's look at the SAT data set again from information from 2010. So expenditure, we want to look at X equal expenditure, Y equals math. So let's take a look at this. What's expenditure? Well, let's see, average expenditure per student within the state. And so if we go over here, I guess this is probably in thousands of dollars, or hundreds of dollars. Oh no, it doesn't tell you what the unit is, but it tells us how much they're spending per student in the state as a matter of the educational budget. So let's take a look if we're going to put that on the horizontal axis, and then we'll see what happens with math score in response to the amount of money that gets spent on the state. Just throwing in the points with geom_point, and then we're labeling our graph. And so let's take a look to see what's happening here, what kind of relationship we have. Well, we've got a few states that seem to spend a decent amount of money per student, but overall, with maybe this exception right here, the states that spend more per student are actually having a lower average score on the math SAT. And we've got several states up here with relatively less expenditure per student, but yet they have a much higher mean SAT score. And so it almost looks like we've got a negative association here. The more you spend per student, the less good result that you seem to have on your math SAT score. That seems a little counterintuitive. And so maybe what we need to do is we need to think about, there might be something going kind of funny going on here. And let's go back and look at our data set for just a minute. And I want to focus on this variable SAT percentage. And if we go down here in our help file, percent of students taking the SAT in that state. So we've got a state like, so Alabama has only 8% of their students take the SAT, whereas a state like Delaware has 3/4, or Connecticut has 7/8 of students taking the SAT. So we've got a wide range of students who take the SAT in a state. In some sense, that's because of what the state schools accept in those states. So that we have ACT states and we have SAT states. And so that suggests that maybe we should see if there's a difference in, or if the percentage of students who take the SAT within a state makes a difference. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add an aesthetic to geom_point, where we're going to color in according to SAT percentage. And so that's the only change we're going to make. We're going to add an aesthetic. And this is a good way for checking what we might consider a lurking variable. That is, a variable that has an impact on the relationship, but is not directly under study. And so what we see is the lighter colors correspond to the states that have a greater percentage of students taking the SAT. And what we see here is that most of the heavy SAT states are the ones that are spending a higher percentage or higher amount per student. And we've got states that have relatively few students taking the SAT up here in this quadrant of the scatter plot. And so the idea, I guess, is that if the state has fewer students taking the SAT, the students who are taking the SAT are likely to be looking to apply to out-of-state schools and maybe possibly more prestigious schools. And so that suggests that what's happening here is that it's the better students that are only the better students that are taking the SAT in the ACT states. And so that's why, as it happens, I guess the ACT states are the ones that spend a little bit less per student than the SAT states. And so that's what's explained. That's what we could use to explain the relationship here that we see. This, seemingly counterintuitive relationship at first makes much more sense when we realize that that the percentage of students in the state who take the SAT definitely has an impact on what the average result would be within the state. So let's do a little bit more with this. And here's another command that we're going to be spending time with in Chapter 4, mutate. Mutate is a way of adding new columns to our data set. And so we're going to add a new column called SAT rate, and it's going to be either low, medium, or high, depending on whether between 0 and 30% of students in the state take the SAT, between 30 and 60, or more than 60% take it. And so we're adding a categorical variable to our data set using the mutate command. And we'll do much more with mutate in the next chapter. And so here's what we've got when we look at, well, let's actually go back and let's run this. In our studio. So we got this new data set now called SAT-GR. And then if I do a view of it, we're going to see that a new column has been added. And here it is. SAT rate has been added using the mutate command. And we either have low rates, medium rates, or high rates, depending on whether it's between 0 and 30, between 30 and 60, or between 60 and 100. Again, we will spend much more time with mutate in the next chapter. But what we can do then is we can add an aesthetic to geom_point, where now it's not by SAT percentage, by SAT rate. And let's add regression lines to this as well. Again, by SAT rate. So we're going to be using geom smooth with linear model. We're going to turn off the bands, and we'll map color so the color of the regression line matches the color of the points. And so we see we've got these three different categories. The blue states are the ones that have a high, or 60% or greater. The greens are the 30 to 60, and the reds, orangey reds, are the ones from 0 to 30. And so we see that there's a positive association, actually, very slight positive association among the high SAT rate states, more of a positive association for the low SAT states, low rate states, and it's pretty flat for the medium ones. And so we see that while it looked like there was a negative correlation, a negative association between expenditure and average score, we see that when we break it down by rate, we actually get some positive associations, although they're not strongly positive. So the mutate command, very useful, and then we can then we're doing some of the things. Once we've got that extra column, we're able to do some of the things that we saw we could do in the first slideshow. And then lastly, I want to talk about line plots here. The first one we're going to look at is one of the graphics that we saw back in Chapter 2, in the slideshow for Chapter 2, swim records. So our variable here, our horizontal variable, is going to be time of some sort. In this case, it's going to be by year. If we do a geom line where we're coloring by sex, and we're doing a geo point where we're doing shape by sex, we commented on that back in Chapter 2. We're layering here with lines and points. We see we do indeed get the same graphic that we saw back in the slideshow for Chapter 2. So again, I'll invite you to stop here, take a look at what commands we use to generate this plot, and you can see that it's actually not that difficult to get a nice plot like this. But let's look at something involving baby names. We're going to be looking at the baby names data set in our exercises, and we'll be doing some things with it over the course of our course. And so um, let's take a look at baby names. So here we've got it tells us about the year a child was born, their sex, what their name was, how many children had that name in a given year, and prop is the proportion of students, proportion of babies that were born with that name. So we got that information. So we've got year born, the gender, the name, how many had that name, and what the proportion was. So let's see what we can do with that. So I'm going to apply a filter on this, and I'm going to look at a graph of how what the proportion of babies born with my name how that's looked over time. And so our x variable is going to be the year of birth. This data set goes back to the 1880s, and the y coordinate is going to be the proportion of births with that name. And then I'm going to add a line, have a line run through the points, and adding a label on the y-axis. So let's see what happened with babies named William over time. We can see that it was very, very popular back in 1880, and the popularity has declined relatively steadily over the past 140 years. There was a leveling off in the early 1900s, then it decreased again, slightly leveled off slightly again around the time of the Great Depression, World War II, decreased again. Throughout the 60s, it leveled off, and it's been tailing off steadily since. So just a little bit about me. I was named for my paternal grandfather. He was born in the very late 1800s, somewhere right around in here when it was a more popular name. And then lots of, relatively speaking, the decline stopped in the 1960s when I was born. And I had a few classmates in my graduating class who were either Williams, Bills, or Billies. And so I can believe that there was a leveling off during the time when I was born, and it's gone down steadily since. So anyway, this is how we would read a plot, and I invite you to try adjusting this for your own name and seeing what happens with that. But let's explore other things with baby names. Let's compare. The last thing we're going to do in this slideshow is compare some names that have been given to both men and women over the years, and compare their relative rates of being bestowed upon children over this time frame. And so unisex is going to be just the list of names: Jesse, Marion, and Jackie. These are three names that have been given to both men and women historically. And then we're going to filter baby names down by looking for only the rows in that data set that have one of those three names in it. And then we can do line plots on all three of these names. And here's a new little twist for us. Facet underscore grid is going to facet by two variables, and name and sex here. And we're going to see that name is going to be, we have names in rows and sex in columns. And so let's check that out. So the women are going to be all in this column. The men are going to be all in this column. And so our row headings are going to be the individual names in unisex: Jackie, Jesse, and Marion. We go in alphabetical order. And so we can get a sense side by side how, for instance, Jackie had a big spike here right around 1960, probably had something to do with Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. And there was, for men, it was a more lengthy period of time where it was relatively popular. Looks like from about 1930 to about 1960, and it tailed off after Jackie Onassis came around. And then you can brief compare how both Jesse and Marion played out over time as well. And so this is one way to compare it. Another way to do it is to get both graphics for the same name for both men and women on the same plots. And so let's do a facet wrap just on the name. And uh, so we can see here, again, we're filtering on these three names. We're putting year on the uh, horizontal axis, the number of individuals with that name on the vertical axis. So it's not proportion this time, it's number of individuals. We're going to do different colors by men for men and women. And then we're going to facet wrap on the name, and we're going to stack them. And so let's see if when we get three rows, what we get. We can again see that Jackie, men named Jackie outpaced women named Jackie for a long time until around the time that Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis came into the spotlight, and then men go down, women spike. For women, Jessie was much more. They were relatively popular at the same time here around 1920, but women have generally outpaced men in terms of Jessie. They really dipped. Women dipped here, where men stayed relatively steady throughout the 60s and 70s. And then Marion was very popular, uh, relatively popular for women around the same time that Jessie was popular. It was spike peaking for men too around this time, but much less popular. So anyway, we get a definite sense. We can read these graphs and see uh, how we can compare the tails of these names over time for both men and women. So this gives us a sense of what we can do with scatter plots and line plots, and we'll be playing with these things more as the course goes on.